to Global South Rising. I'm Ileana Chan with my co-host here, Sara Vivacqua. And we also have a special guest, a special recurring guest, Carlos Martinez. So quickly, I think most of you know Carlos from Friends of Socialist China. He also has his own YouTube channel, Invent the Future. There are links down in the description. I actually remembered to put all the links down there. There's a Friends of Socialist China website where you can sign up for the mailing list, and also Carlos's book, The East is Still Red, which is behind me here. We always talk about this book, but it's actually a really good book. Like, people should just read it because it gives you a really good overview. So welcome, Carlos and Sara. Before I get into everything, this is the Global South Rising. We break down the news every week from an anti-imperialist lens. Sara, how are you today? Is she frozen? I think Sarah's frozen. Luckily, it's frozen on a very flattering picture of her, but I think she's frozen. So let's move over to you, Carlos. How are you doing today?
I'm pretty good. Yeah, very well, thank you. Looking forward to talking about everything in the world with you guys.
Yeah, so we have a lot going on today. I'm just going to pull up our list of stuff. Here we're going to be talking about the Cuba oil lifeline that just sort of happened. You're going to break that down for us, Carlos. Then we're going to talk about Trump's Iran war whiplash. He's all over the place as per usual, but we're going to talk about what that actually means. And then updates on China pushing for peace negotiations around the world. We're going to have an update on Maduro's case, and of course the KMT, or rather I'm doing a watch on the KMT's upcoming visit to Beijing and what that could possibly mean. So I'm excited about today. I have a few announcements while we wait for Sara. So on Monday, and I'm going to have to announce this at the end as well. So please remind me, Carlos. But on Monday, I'm doing a special Cuba live show with, here's our vid cover, why Cuba needs us now, how you can help. Our live special on Monday at 7 p.m. BST, that's 7 p.m. London time. It's a little bit confusing because of daylight savings, but we'll put all the times underneath the description. That's like live right now. The link is live right now on our channel. It will be with the Assata Shakur Brigade. This is an organization in revolutionary solidarity with Cuba. I'm just going to pull up their website here so you guys can see that. So yeah, this is an organization in revolutionary solidarity with Cuba based in Britain. It organizes delegation to Cuba that provide material support and contribution to voluntary labor as part of the tradition of solidarity bridges with Cuba. The brigade is made up of a coalition of groups including Code Pink, Iskra Books, Black Liberation Alliance, and independent doctors, lawyers, and researchers. Actually, me and Sara had actually wanted to join them, but we could not do it for logistical reasons. So we're bringing them onto Empire Watch live on Monday. Please join us, and you can figure out, people can also contribute to their cause, but also figure out how they can personally help Cuba they're interested in. It's a 2-part series. So this Monday will be the first part where we talk about the practical ways you can help Cuba. And then the second Monday, we'll have an update on their campaign, but also we'll talk a little bit more in depth about why Cuba is significant to all anti-imperialists. So that's my announcement for that. And then of course I do have another announcement, which we sort of touched upon last week. But since you're here, Carlos, we might as well talk about it again. It's the Socialist China Maxing, arranged and organized by Friends of Socialist China. And I'm there in a very old headshot, a very pretty headshot, if I say so myself. But yes, and Carlos, you'll be chairing it, won't you? Will you be chairing it? Am I correct?
I will indeed be chairing it.
Yes, which I'm excited about, and I will be speaking on it, which I am very nervous about. So that'll be good. But it's Socialist China Maxing, how China's achievements are a product of its socialist system. This is a really important subject because, as we know, it's going to be co-opted by Western media to sort of suggest that China Maxing is just like a social media trend, and it's really not. There is very significant reasons why we need to associate this with socialism. So I'm excited about that, and I hope everyone will join us. And it's on Sunday at 12, Sunday, 12th of April, not 2025, 2026.
Oh my God. It's the wrong year in the image. I didn't even notice that.
Year, but it's at 3 p.m. Britain time on 12th of April, 2026. Cool. All right.
Ileana, Carlos, you forgot to say the lineup. Who's there? And that Carlos is one of the organizers. Yeah.
I did. I already said that. I just said it. Yeah. Carlos is the co-founder of Friends of Socialist China. Friends of Socialist China is organizing it, and Carlos will be chairing it. And yeah, as you can see here, there's a lot of really, George Galloway, Chen Wei-hua, Li Jingjing, Ben Norton, Danny Haifeng, Ting's Chak. And Chao Collective is also going to be there as well, someone from Chao Collective, which I'm going to be using Chao Collective as a resource in my watch for Taiwan. They're really amazing. I have a link again down below to their website. So please check that out. It's going to be a really exciting webinar, I think. Anyway, okay, so let's remove that, and yeah, let's crack on to it. Like, Sarah, do you want to begin grilling Carlos on Cuba?
I think we can begin doing the job. Yeah, I'll start by giving you support.
I will do the interrogation. You will do the support.
Okay, good.
Go ahead, Sarah.
You can start. No, you can start. You can start with the first question. I think it's better if you start with your question. I think it fits better.
No, that's your. I think that's your question, Sarah. Go for it.
Okay. Well, so we've seen that Donald Trump accepted the arrival of the Russian vessel Anatoly Kolodkin. Apologies for the pronunciation, at Matanzas in Cuba. So we saw this vessel carrying approximately between 650, 730 barrels of oil. And we saw also the White House trying to sell this as a is a gesture of humanitarian pragmatism. At the same time, they were claiming victory over Cuba. Oh, well, Cuba is finished, is what Trump said. And we just people in Cuba needed. We want Cuba already, and Cuba needed. But on the other hand, we had the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, stating, look, this matter was raised before. We entered in contact with our American partners. We discussed it. So we are not dealing here with a tactical surprise that Washington failed to prevent. But this is an operation that was known, discussed, and tolerated. So, Carlos, why did Trump allow the cargo to reach Cuba? And should we be reading this as an American defeat?
Right. I mean, the first thing to say is that this is kind of being portrayed by the US as some kind of act of benevolence. It's not. It's not an act of benevolence, right? Russia has every right to deliver oil to Cuba. This is a bilaterally agreed phenomenon between the two countries. Russia is navigating through international waters, and that delivery of oil is totally 100% within the limits of international law, right? What would be 100% outside the limits of international law would be the United States Coast Guard intercepting this tanker. So, it's just funny. It's kind of ironic that we're in this situation where the US regime is into such flagrant illegality that we're actually amazed when they do occasionally adhere to international law and to the established norms of relations between states. I think it's I think it represents a tactical concession from the US. And Peskov confirmed that this was raised in advance with the US. So they had an agreement that the Coast Guard wouldn't accept it, wouldn't intercept. And Trump kind of pretty randomly said that he had no problem with countries sending fuel to Cuba, which is the opposite of what he said, what he was saying just a week or 2 weeks ago. But the main factor is obviously Iran. The war has been going on for over a month now. The Strait of Hormuz is essentially closed, or it's certainly closed to the US, certainly closed to Israel, and those countries that support their criminal war. Energy prices are surging. The Brent crude oil price has gone from around $60 from before the start of the war to 110, 120 now. It's on its way up. Maybe it'll be 150 soon, maybe it'll be 175 soon, which is a point at which the economy starts to shut down, right? Factories can't operate, services can't operate. Anything involving transport becomes basically impossible. So that's going to impact the economy at every level, from at the micro level, at the personal level, like heating your home is going to become much more expensive. At the macro level, all these artificial intelligence data centers are going to have to close down because they can't afford to operate, right? So in that context, the US is easing its sanctions on Russia. It's looking to Russia to increase its supply of oil and natural gas. To the extent that the US has agreed with India and Europe, having forced India and Europe to stop receiving Russian natural gas, the US has agreed with them that they can purchase Russian oil and gas for the moment. So, intercepting a Russian tanker in international waters on its way to Cuba, in that context, would be a big escalation when, in terms of the relationship with Russia, the US actually needs to de-escalate a little bit. And meanwhile, I think Cuba's own actions, Cuba's own behavior is an important factor here as well. Like, Cuba's refusing to buckle under this blockade. Cuba's showing once again its resilience. Cuba's withstood everything that the empire's thrown at it. Cuba has withstood. From starting with the Bay of Pigs invasion at the beginning of the 1960s, the missile crisis, the Operation Mongoose, the hundreds of attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro and other Cuban leaders, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the special period, the introduction of market mechanisms, the introduction of tourism, etc., etc. And Cuba's been preparing for US aggression of every variety, of every form, since the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, since the establishment of this Republic of Cuba in its current socialist form in 1959. It's a social system with a very high degree of popular legitimacy. And Trump has miscalculated, as all US leaders have miscalculated, that they can just impose blockades and they can make life difficult for the Cuban people, and that will break their will, right? But the fact is, they're seeing, again, as they've seen many times before, that the Cuban people support their system, they support their government, they're very well organized, they're very well mobilized. You've got people still alive in Cuba who've got that historical memory of what Cuba was like before 1959, which is basically, an island playground for the US elite. It was an apartheid semi-colony. It was, you could compare it with Epstein's Island, right? Little St. James or whatever it's called. That was what Cuba was, and the Cubans don't want to go back to that. Meanwhile, even obviously this energy blockade has been incredibly difficult to deal with, and Cubans have been dealing with energy blackouts of up to 20 hours a day, and it makes life kind of almost impossible, right? But they haven't just lied down in the face of that. They've ramped up their own energy production. They've been working with China to get their solar photovoltaic parks online. There's now, I think, 45 solar parks online that are fueling Cuban industry. So I think, it will turn out that this energy blockade has just been another attempt by the United States to suffocate Cuba that hasn't worked. And They hope to bring about regime change. They can't bring about regime change. The best they could hope for is like regime collapse, like Cuba collapsing into just total chaos, right? With the economy 100% closed down. That's what the US could maybe hope to achieve. But do they actually want that? If they think about it, would Trump's base, which is highly xenophobic, highly anti-immigrant, would they be happy with 10 million Cubans trying to make their way to Florida? So, the bottom line is that I think allowing the Russian tanker through to Cuba it's a tactical concession, primarily driven by the pressures of the Iran war, and the logic of this US-Russia diplomatic dance. But it also reveals that the US coercive power has got its limits. It's a reminder that as powerful as the empire seems, it's not all powerful. And it's also a reminder of the creative brilliance of the Cuban people, and the international solidarity is a very powerful force.
I think like one of the things that's kind of funny is this is one of Trump's tactics to make sure that the US still maintains this veneer of an invincible power. If anything happens that may be against his expressed wishes, he then will say, "Oh, I allowed that. I did that. I let them through, even if it's actually because they didn't have the power to stop it, say, in this particular circumstance."
I have a follow-up question here. You were talking about the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, changing relationships between US and Russia. We wouldn't imagine that. And what about Europe? Do we see any changes in the relationship between Russia and Europe, or potential?
Yeah, it's another complicated question. We've seen for the last year and a half, or particularly since Trump's re-election, that whereas the US has shown some signs of wanting to extricate itself from this mess in Ukraine, this is a war that's essentially started by the US, a proxy war against Russia, where they've been willing to, as people have commented, fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, so sacrificing the lives of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians for the sake of this proxy war, where they're trying to weaken, destabilize Russia with a view to ultimately replacing a kind of nationalist and anti-imperialist state with a proxy kind of client state, or even break the country up and turn it into 3 or 4 different countries that can be more easily controlled, and that would allow the US to have deeper control of energy flows in the region, and to further its aims of encircling and containing China. So that war basically starts in 2014 with the Maidan coup and escalates massively in 2022, obviously. And I think there's a section of the US ruling class, essentially represented by Trump and his regime, that recognize that this is, the US is losing this war, NATO is losing this war, the EU is losing this war, and therefore it makes sense to try and extricate themselves, find a way to call it a victory, and move on to the next thing, move on to their more important overall project, which is ramping up the war against China. So, but what we've seen is that as the US has been trying to move on and bring about some kind of negotiated peace in Ukraine, it's the European leaders who've really wanted to carry on. Even though this war has gone completely against the interests of the people of Europe, it's caused a cost of living crisis, it's caused an inflation crisis, it's caused energy prices to increase massively. You used to have huge volumes of Russian gas piped directly into Central Europe via the Nord Stream pipeline. That's been replaced by liquid natural gas, hydroelectric hydraulically fracked shale gas from North America. So they extract this stuff at huge environmental cost. Then they cool it to something like minus 100 degrees Celsius, put it on containers, and ship it across the Atlantic Ocean. It's from an economic and an environmental point of view, it's an incredibly costly process, and costs probably three times more than Russian gas was costing. So that's been massively damaging to European interests. And you've got, in places like Britain, in places like France, in places like Belgium and Germany, you've got tens of thousands of elderly people who are dying from hypothermia because they can't afford to heat their homes in the winter. And we're doing all this for what reason? Because we want to attack Russia and we want to fight a war that we can't win against Russia. But the European leaders are so short-sighted, so myopic, so lacking in vision and so lacking in imagination that they want to keep on fighting this war because they think that it brings them some legitimacy. Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Friedrich Merz, they think they're war leaders. They think that they derive legitimacy, they derive support from helping this poor victim Ukraine and being best friends with Vladimir Zelensky. So for very short-sighted political reasons, they're choosing to continue to add fuel to that fire. So the relationship between EU and Russia continues to be extremely bad, and Europe is acting as a brake on the process of establishing some kind of peace in Ukraine, which is very shameful. All for the sake of having Russia as this big bad enemy, and that's another aspect to it as well, right? It's always valuable to failing states, to a declining capitalism, which can't solve the problems that its people have. You look at Britain, for example. Homelessness is rising, inequality is rising, hunger is rising, child poverty is rising, unemployment is rising. Conditions are getting substantially worse. And for the government, it's like a useful narrative to be able to say, "Oh, it's Russia's fault." And the economic factor is that the one aspect of the Western economies which is not completely failing is the military-industrial complex, right? So having Russia as an enemy gives us an excuse, gives us some public justification that we should invest in weapons of mass destruction rather than in building schools and hospitals and infrastructure and public investment. So, I think the Europe-Russia relationship hasn't meaningfully changed. I think it might start to change, especially as Europeans develop some distance from the United States, from the Trump regime. For example, Europe has not given the support to the US-Israeli war in Iran that Trump would have liked. So there are some fissures emerging there. So that might open up a possibility for an improvement of relations between Russia and Europe, but we're probably still a long way off.
One thing that strikes me is the Russia, and I think when you say they can gain credibility by fighting Russia, I think they do. That's the worst part. I haven't seen such a Russophobic population as the European population. The level of hatred and the level of distrust and stigmatization of the Russian is no better than in the Cold War at all. So I think they do gain a lot of points with the European population by claiming the Russia's enemy. I think this is still a very, very valid populistic flag. I remember in the civil service when the war against Ukraine, the invasion against Ukraine, which was actually NATO expanding its border to the point of total provocation to Russia started, we had to bake cakes on a weekly basis to save Ukraine. I remember, yeah. And not one single cake was baked for Palestine. you know, and we had to bake and go and buy cakes for Ukraine to help the war. You had, if you go today to Berlin, you have every single public building a flag from Ukraine. All of a sudden, Germans hate East Europeans. Never, Germany hates Ukraine. All of a sudden, UK became the most beloved country in Europe. We're starting to having workshops for Ukrainian women that were, let's say, victimized by the war. We started to have progressive left hosting Ukrainian people in their homes. Anything is possible against Russia. It's crazy. The cake baking, I think, was one of the most pathetic things I've ever seen. And everybody loved it. Everybody.
If that doesn't tell you that we own that war, that war is actually instigated by the U.S. imperialist system, i.e. the UK, the U.S., if that doesn't actually tell you that, then I don't know what is going to convince you, you know what I mean? Like, it's so clearly that is our war. That's why we are supporting Ukraine in this fashion with bake sales. But also it is a sort of well, at least Mark Rutte, the NATO chief, has been, is it NATO chief? Yeah, I mean, he has been really using Russia as like an existential sort of reason for NATO to exist. You know, the push for 5% military increase, to have 5% of their budget be GDP, I think, be 5% across the board. All that, the reasons he's giving is because Russia is going to invade if we don't do that, you know. So it's very much so like they're using it in an existential purpose for NATO to exist, because otherwise, at least in their reasoning, it's like they can pretend that NATO is a defense alliance by saying that Russia is a threat. Otherwise, there's no purpose.
We saw in one of our shows the leaked German military document, which would go, they're planning to go on war on Russia in 2030, I guess. And with a whole civil social structure, autobahns and everything. In Germany, it's, and even in the left, you can be for Palestine, but you can't see anything that supports Russia. It's
because we're on the other side of that, aren't we? So it makes so much sense when you just see the balances of power, then it makes sense. You know what I mean? Like, why people are still confused about this issue is another thing. Why people are pro-Ukraine and then pro-Palestine. I mean, this is like a matter of the inability to think through a logical conclusion. I mean, this is like a lack of intelligence in that regard. I'm sorry, but it's true. But the fact is, it's very, very clear. If we are supporting Ukraine and we are supporting Israel, what does that tell you? We're involved in it. From that, it should give you some clues. Anyway, our audience knows all this. I mean, I think our audience is not. I would hope that none of our audience would fall for that. But yeah, like, so moving on again, like, I think, Sarah, you wanted to talk about the significance of Cuba as part of that anti-imperialist system, which I think is a really important point.
Yeah, I think Cuba is very often reduced to the resistance against the US blockade. And some people would say Cuba is not a threat. Cuba is a small island. And we forget all about its foreign policy of internationalism. Remarkable, unique, maybe underappreciated chapters of Cold War anti-imperialist and colonial liberation. Africa was a central point of Che Guevara's vision, and Cuba involvement in Congo, Angola, Guinea-Bissau for self-determination were defining fights. And Carlos, I just want you to walk us through about, first of all, is Cuba a threat or is Cuba no threat? And what is Cuba internationalist contribution?
Sure. I mean, yeah, Cuba is a threat, and it isn't a threat. It's not a threat in the sense of being a physical threat. Cuba is a peaceful country. Cuba's a force for peace, right? Cuba is not threatening the United States. It's not threatening any country, in the Americas or anywhere. Cuba's vision is to live in peace with its neighbors, but it is the thread of a good example, and its internationalism is a very big part of that, right? And I think internationalism is part of Cuba's DNA, let's say, and actually the internationalism doesn't begin with the socialist revolution. You could argue that it goes back to José Martí, the liberation struggle against Spain. José Martí said that the independence struggle it's not just a national project, it's a continental project, and it's a universal project. We are fighting for the liberation of the continent, of the Americas, and indeed the world. And in 1936, hundreds of Cubans volunteered to fight fascism in Spain. They participated on the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. Actually, in proportion to its population, Cuba sent more volunteers to Spain than any country in the world. So it's quite a remarkable thing. And the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, they inherited that tradition of internationalism and have obviously taken it forward, and have theorized that within an overall context of world revolution and revolutionary self-defense. And Fidel Castro famously said, "The United States has globalized the struggle against Cuba in order to suffocate the revolution. Therefore, we have globalized the revolutionary struggle against the United States." And there's lots of extraordinary examples of Cuban internationalism that go well beyond what one would expect of a pretty small Caribbean island population around 10 million. It very much punches above its weight. Che Guevara's African mission is often overlooked. After his role in the Cuban Revolution, he went to Congo in 1965 to support the Simba uprising there, which was being coordinated by followers of Patrice Lumumba, who'd been murdered 4 years earlier. And can you just imagine, like, the number 2 leader of a socialist state that's had its revolution a few years ago, going to another country in another continent to wage guerrilla warfare, right? I think it's very difficult to get our heads around this. You could have someone who was in a revolutionary system that was so committed to internationalism, that was so committed to the global revolution, that was so committed to the struggle against imperialism, that joined the dots between different struggles around the world to such an extent that they would send their number 2, the deputy chief of the revolutionary process, to engage in leading or supporting guerrilla warfare struggles. So it reflects a deep, deep sense of solidarity, which is, I think, probably unparalleled in modern history. Angola is probably the most important, the largest, the most kind of consequential internationalist mission of all the internationalist missions that Cuba's been involved in. Between 1975 and 1991, 375,000 Cuban armed forces members served in Angola. 2,000 gave their lives to protect Angolan independence. The Battle of Quito Carnevale in 1988 was led by the Cubans, and the Cubans were very closely involved in this. Fidel Castro was working on military strategy for the war in Angola every day. That was one of the main items on his agenda every day in that period. And this battle in Quito Carnevale, it was the turning point in the struggle for to preserve Angola's independence, to win Namibia's independence, and to dismantle the apartheid state in South Africa. It was the largest military engagement in Africa since World War II. And Isaac Saney, who's written a very brilliant book on this subject, he estimates that the defeat of South Africans at Cuito Carnevale accelerated the end of apartheid by 25 years. So, we could just be, okay, so South Africa had its first democratic elections in 1994. If that had been delayed by 25 years, then apartheid would have been dismantled in 2019, right? Just a few years ago. And Nelson Mandela, he visited Cuba in 1991. Actually, Cuba was the first country outside of Africa that Mandela went to after he was released from prison. And he said in Havana that the Cuban internationalists have made a contribution to African independence, freedom, and justice that's unparalleled for its principled and selfless character. It's unparalleled in African history to have another people rise to the defense of one of us. And he goes on to say, lots of other countries have come to Africa. They've colonized us, they've brutalized us, they've pillaged us, they've raped us. So to have a country from the other side of the world come and help completely selflessly without expectation of payment or anything like that, to support our struggle for independence, to support our struggle for liberation is an incredible thing. Cuba's, you could argue that it's the most internationalist country in history, that its foreign policy is very firmly rooted in solidarity, in anti-imperialism. Cuba also sent troops in support to Guinea-Bissau, to Algeria for the War of Independence in Algeria, to Guinea, to Ethiopia, to Western Sahara, Mozambique, Grenada, Nicaragua. And the other side of Cuba's internationalism is its medical missions. As people often comment, Cuba's #1 export is its doctors. While the US and Europe export weapons of mass destruction, Cuba exports medical personnel, and you've got more than 400,000 Cuban medical personnel that have served in over 150, 160 countries over the course of the revolutionary period. At this very moment, there's around 25,000 Cuban healthcare workers who are active in 50, 60 countries. Now, very sadly, that's been dismantled to some extent under US pressure. You've got Caribbean countries, including Jamaica, that are being basically coerced by the Americans into canceling their medical cooperation with Cuba. But ultimately, you're talking about a blockaded island, 90 miles from the most powerful military empire in the history of the planet, that chooses to send its own people to die for the liberation of people they've never met on a continent thousands of miles away. So it's a country that's completely committed to the global struggle against imperialism and for socialism.
Thank you for this incredibly knowledgeable. I think Carlos is one of our most knowledgeable guests. You can ask him about anything you know in detail, with dates, numbers, and everything, and amazing analysis. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. So now that, just to remind everyone, I'm putting in the chat that we're doing a live special on Monday, April 6th, 7 p.m. London, with the Assata Shakur Brigade that is actually going to be bringing aid to Cuba. So I'm just going to, sorry about that. The link that I've sent in the thing is kind of malfunctioning, but just like, click onto below in the description and just like go to their website so you can see. Okay, I've sent a good one. Okay, cool. But moving on to current news, like we are really grilling you, Carlos. We're going to be basically talking about all the world events here. But the US-Israeli war on Iran, Trump just gave a new speech on Wednesday, and I'm just going to pull this up. I'm going to quote from it. So please, trigger warning for everyone who has a weak stomach when listening to Trump. It's going to be basically a whiplash. Yeah, so basically, as we know, we're in the 5th week of the US-Israeli war on Iran. Trump has issued a series of sharply conflicting statements about the Iran war. In this particular address that just happened on Wednesday, he says, we are going to hit them extremely hard over the next 2 to 3 weeks. We're going to bring them back to the Stone Ages where they belong. So just like imagine that as an address out loud from the US president. But then in the next sentence, he says, in the meantime, discussions are ongoing. Regime change was not our goal. We never said regime change, but regime change has occurred because of all of their original leaders' death. They're all dead. The new group is less radical and much more reasonable. Can we unpack the discrepancy between, like, as we have talked about and as from the beginning of this war, when we have been questioning what is the US's goal in Iran, regime change was one of their main speculated intentions. Regime change in order to further control Iran, in order to further control that region. But let's talk about the discrepancy between their stated aim or their speculated aims versus the unintended lasting consequences of this unprovoked war. Also, as you can see with Trump, he's all over the place. But are there any realistic, available off-ramps for the US at this point? What do you think, Carlos?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the stated intentions, the big thing obviously has been trying to prevent Iran from attaining nuclear weapons, which I think everyone knows at this point is a completely farcical argument. Like, does anyone actually believe that? That you've got two nuclear states, one, the largest nuclear power in the world, the United States, with around 5,500 nuclear warheads, and the other undeclared nuclear power that has, probably 200, 300 nuclear warheads, but it doesn't allow the International Atomic Energy Association to inspect its nuclear plants, but has had nuclear weapons for probably 50 years, right? So you've got two nuclear powers that are attacking a non-nuclear power to prevent it from being a nuclear power. I mean, from a basic, framework of moral justice, does anyone buy that? And furthermore, with Iran, you're talking about a country that has said hundreds and hundreds of times, we don't want nuclear weapons. That Iran has had a fatwa in place, right? A religious edict in place against the development of nuclear weapons, or indeed against any type of weapons of mass destruction. So at a constitutional level, Iran opposes nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, right, for religious and ideological reasons, okay? Quite a few people have commented that if Iran actually did have nuclear weapons, then they wouldn't be coming under attack. Why hasn't the United States gone to war against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea? It's because the DPRK has got nuclear weapons, and so the costs of attacking it are very high. You can't engage in nuclear blackmail with North Korea, whereas you can engage in nuclear blackmail with Iran. But the point is, Iran has nuclear power facilities. It has the right to enrich uranium. It's a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It doesn't want nuclear weapons, but you've got these two nuclear powers attacking it. So, and Trump has even said now that he doesn't, he's not worried about the Iranian uranium enrichment. He said, well, we can monitor that by satellite, etc., which is essentially part of him looking for an off-ramp and looking for a way to present the whole thing as a victory and having, some kind of option on the table to put an end to this war. The nuclear question was really Donald Trump's equivalent to Iraqi weapons of mass destruction or whatever, but nobody's fooled. The other stated intention of this war is to preserve Israel's security, right? So people have said that Israel is under threat. Well, this is mainly Netanyahu's argument. Israel is under threat as long as Iran continues to be a so-called aggressive regime. But, well, the main thing there is that there's no such thing as Israeli security while it continues to be an apartheid state, and while it continues to be this expansionist force with its vision, with its pursuit of a so-called Eretz, Greater Israel, right? Israel could have had its security. It could have been very simple, actually. If Israel had accepted the incredibly generous offer that's been on the table for over 30 years of a state of Israel alongside a state of Palestine, based on 1967 borders, where the Palestinian state is composed of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. That leaves almost 80% of historic Palestine in Israeli hands. It's unbelievably generous. You come to my house, you take 80% of it and leave me with 20%, and I say, well, that's fine. We can work on this basis. If Israel had been willing to go along with what was supposedly agreed, Oslo, if they'd been willing to go along with the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state, if they'd been willing to give up on their expansionist ambitions, then they could have had peace, they could have had security, but they didn't accept any of that. And now I think it's kind of probably too late, at the point at which they've been carrying out a genocide in Gaza for 2.5 years. They're occupying most of the West Bank. They're waging war on Lebanon. They're waging war on Iran. They've waged war in Syria. They've waged war in Yemen. At this point, in my humble opinion, the only hope for Israelis to have peace is to stop being Israelis. It's to drop this racist ideology of Zionism and to accept existence as equals in a democratic state of Palestine that has equal rights for all. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish, doesn't matter if you're Muslim, doesn't matter if you're Christian, if you're atheist, follower of no religion or whatever, you've got your basic human rights and you're an equal in that state. That's how Israelis can get safety. That's how they can get security at this point. Iran never initiated any attack against Israel. Iran does support Palestinian resistance, it's true, but even if they're able to wipe out the Iranian government, even if they were able to revert to a situation like existed under the Shah before 1979, where Iran was an ally of Israel, do you think that's going to end Palestinian resistance? Resistance will continue under all circumstances. Palestinians are suffering colonial occupation, they're suffering apartheid, they're suffering genocide. They're not going to simply give up on their basic national rights. So, the actual motivation with this war in Iran, I think it is regime change. That was the idea. They thought they could carry out a decapitation strike against Ali Khamenei and against a few top leaders, bomb a few buildings, shock Iranians, use their Mossad contacts on the ground to build some kind of, something that looks like a color revolution, I suppose, and achieve regime change and get rid of a government that has for 47 years been absolutely resolutely, absolutely firmly anti-imperialist, that has always protected its sovereignty, that has always supported Palestine, that has always supported liberation struggles around the world, and that controls its own national resources, that controls its own oil, that controls its own gas. And that, that's a big part of it as well, the securing US control over energy flows, which also links into the bigger picture, the bigger geopolitical picture of the new Cold War against China, the campaign of containment and encirclement of China, controlling energy flows, be it in Iran, be it in Greenland, be it in Venezuela, etc. That is, to a significant degree, about having leverage over China. If the US decides at some point in the future to carry out a hot war against China, then being able to cut off energy supplies and control these pinch points, the Strait of Hormuz, the Malacca Straits, etc., will be very, very important. And Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, put this case very clearly. He said, a positive US relationship with the new Iranian regime really benefits the US, particularly against China, and it weakens China. So that's the motivation. That was the idea in going to war against Iran. That said, the US is losing, Israel is losing. The war hasn't achieved any of its objectives. They expected that these assassinations, that these decapitation strikes would result in a quick regime change. That was wishful thinking. It's clear that the government's got very broad popular support. It's clear that the basic constitutional framework of the country has got very broad popular support. You've got millions of people out in the street every night in Tehran, in other cities in Iran, right, that are standing up for their sovereignty. The military structure hasn't collapsed at all. Every day the Israelis tell us and the US tells us, oh, we've wiped out the Iranian drone stores, the missile stores. We've wiped out their military capacity. We've wiped out their navy. But every day we see Tel Aviv under attack. We see Haifa under attack. We see Eilat under attack. We see US military and economic interests in Bahrain, in the UAE, in Saudi, in Kuwait, etc., under attack. Just last night, a second F-35 was downed by the Iranians. So two F-35s have been downed by the Iranians now. And those are the first F-35s in history to be downed. And these are incredibly sophisticated, incredibly expensive pieces of equipment. It costs around $100 million to produce one of these F-35 warplanes. You've got missiles and drones causing immense damage to Israel, causing immense damage to the US military and economic assets in the Gulf. Iran has been able to leverage its control over the Strait of Hormuz to basically cause havoc for global capital. The International Energy Agency has said that this is the greatest energy security threat in history. The volume of gas that's been cut off is twice what Europe lost from Russia in 2022. And going back to your question earlier, Sara, about Europe-Russia relations, that's probably what's going to change Europe-Russia relations, is that having lost all of this gas that was coming from the Persian Gulf, they're going to need some gas from Russia. As I said earlier, oil has hit $115, $120 a barrel. And the US admit now not Donald Trump doesn't admit, but the security services admit, and the Israeli military intelligence admits that the war hasn't created conditions for regime change. There haven't been any high-level desertions. The military is still operating very effectively. The people are obviously strongly united, more united than ever, right? I think the Iranian people are united, like totally united around their government in a way that, to a far greater degree than they were before. Trump keeps announcing, well, we're winning, the US is winning. Iranian munition stocks have been wiped out, but the Iranians keep fighting and they keep escalating in response to US and Israeli escalation. I think Trump is, as you've said, looking for an off-ramp. The US clearly wants to end the war. And so it's just a matter of finding some kind of way to extract themselves from the situation while painting it as a victory, which of course is very important for the US in general, and particularly for slightly deranged narcissists like Donald Trump. Israel is happy to keep fighting for the moment. You're in a situation where I think Israel, any context other than outright war, means that Israel isn't a viable project anymore. Israel would collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions if it weren't for fighting what it can paint as an existential war, right? The government's totally corrupt. The government is hated. They're in an economic mess. Nobody's going to invest in Israel now. Israel is hated worldwide, particularly due to the Gaza genocide. There's not going to be any tourism there. So without this unifying factor of war, then Israel is very precarious. So Israel has got good reasons to carry on fighting, but ultimately it will do what it's told, because Israel can't fight this war without the United States. So if the United States decides that it's time to stop the war, then Israel will have to stop the war. The biggest impediment to Trump's plans of finding an off-ramp actually is Iran, because Iran has got a very clear position that Iran won't settle for anything less than victory. Iran's, you had a war in June last year, the so-called 12-day war, that ended in essentially an Iranian victory that Trump was able to present as his own victory. But then, they go back to war 7-8 months later. Iran's not willing to fight this war every few months. So Iran requires the dismantling of US military infrastructure, US infrastructure of power projection in the region, in the Persian Gulf, right? Iran requires international security guarantees that the US and Israel can't do this again. Iran requires reparations, like the US, Israel are bombing, they're not just killing military leaders, they're bombing civilian infrastructure, they're bombing hospitals, they're bombing schools, they're bombing apartment buildings, they're bombing bridges, they're bombing fuel depots. So this is costing the Iranian people billions of dollars, and they have to be compensated for that. Iran requires the right to its legitimate and its completely legal program of civilian nuclear power, and that Iran will retain the right to continue supporting the Palestinian resistance, to continue supporting Hezbollah, to continue supporting Yemen against aggression, against oppression. They will require Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon. They will require meaningful progress towards meeting Palestinian national demands. So Iran can keep fighting. Obviously, Iran didn't want this war. Iran worked to avoid this war. But now that it's in the war, it's fighting to win. Iran can keep fighting. Iran has shown itself to be extremely resilient, extremely resourceful. As I said, there's massive unity behind the government, behind the armed forces. You've got millions of people who are very literally willing to die for the cause of their dignity and their sovereignty, right? And that feeds into some degree of this whole ideological framework of Shia Islam, and this spirit of martyrdom and self-sacrifice that comes down to Imam Hussein and Karbala and whatnot. But millions of people are willing to martyr themselves for the national cause, and it's very difficult to defeat a people like that. Is there a way out? I'm sure they'll turn up. Given that the US wants a way out, given that Iran would like to not be fighting a war, I'm sure we can find a way out. China and Pakistan have put forward a 5-point plan that
yeah, so I'm just going to ask you about this, Carlos. Given the context that you've just given us, which is, thank you for that, a very, very thorough rendering of what's happening. You've sort of laid out that Iran has certain requirements. How much of that, despite the fact that people are claiming China is doing nothing, China is actively working for peace to an end of this war, but how much of their peace agreements in their talks, like this one, I think specifically on the Socialist China, Friends of Socialist China website, talking about how Wang Yi is basically going around the world. Well, he's held, it says here, between March 24th to 27th, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi held telephone discussions with 5 of his counterparts in the regard for, ending the US-Israeli war aggression against Iran. So how much of the talks that is currently happening is reflecting what you're saying about like the demands that Iran would have in order to end this war, and how much of it is allowing any off-ramps for the US? Oh,
yeah.
You're frozen again, unfortunately.
I'm frozen.
Okay,
you can't hear me?
Yeah, you've been frozen for a while. Maybe you have to come out and come in again, maybe, or should I go upstairs? I don't know, because I'm eating all your data here.
Maybe Sarah, if you could switch off yours and then go upstairs, that'd be great. Because you're perfectly clear, so there is internet there. But should we? Okay.
Okay, so I should go upstairs. Go on and upstairs.
Okay. Then I'll just continue with Carlos. So yeah, okay, cool. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so basically regarding these peace plans, these peace talks, just to reiterate, these peace talks with Foreign Minister Wang Yi, how much of that is reflecting Iran's needs in order to end this, end this unprovoked war against them, and how much of it allows an off-ramp for the US, in your opinion?
Well, look, I think what peace looks like is actually pretty clear, and it's pretty close to what the Iranians say they want. Essentially, it's a return to the status quo ante, but with drastically reduced US military presence in the region, with reparations, with internationally binding security guarantees, and a nuclear deal basically along the lines of the JCPOA, the deal that was negotiated by Obama and others in, I think it was 2015. Those are the broad parameters, right? Those are the broad outlines of what we can expect to see. That's essentially what the Iranians want, and I think it's what the Iranians can get, because they've won. They've won that via military means. So any deal is going to include those components, and the tricky thing is going to be presenting that in a way that's palatable to Donald Trump, that's palatable to Benjamin Netanyahu, and that's acceptable to the US public. You've mentioned the 5-point plan that was put forward by China and Pakistan. China's been very active diplomatically in relation to this war. Wang Yi, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, conducted an extraordinary kind of diplomatic blitz in the first few days of the war. He had phone calls with foreign ministers of 12 different countries, consistently called for an immediate ceasefire, consistently called for return to diplomacy. China's representatives at the United Nations called out, the flagrant violation of international law, condemned US-Israeli aggression, called for a ceasefire, called for support to Iran's right to its sovereignty and its right to self-defense. Yeah, the 5-point peace plan is the China-Pakistan plan is not detailed as such, but most importantly, it calls for an immediate ceasefire. It calls for withdrawal of US forces. It calls for withdrawal of Israeli forces, and it calls for resumption of negotiations on a nuclear deal, and for humanitarian access that's led by the United Nations, and a regional security dialogue. So I think China's working really hard to behave in a kind of responsible way, and to behave in line with its international obligations, in line with international law, in line with the principles of the United Nations Charter, and in line with the principles of peaceful coexistence, and generally upholding its consistent foreign policy of non-interference and non-alignment, right? And its leverage is economic and diplomatic, and it's not military. China doesn't have a military alliance with Iran, but it does trade normally with Iran. It does, and that includes military trade. It's supplied missiles, it's supplied air defense systems, it's supplied military training, geo-positioning systems, etc., to Iran, and it's got a very deep economic relationship with Iran. Iran is an important member of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's an important member of BRICS. It's an important member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China and Iran have an extensive and elaborate economic comprehensive agreement. So I think, these sorts of diplomatic moves led by China, Pakistan, and other countries will be very helpful, but ultimately the responsibility lies with the United States for finding some kind of way of presenting their defeat as a victory. that's when the war will end, when Trump and Hegseth and Rubio and these people can find a way to withdraw their forces, end this war, and call it a victory. But it's going to have to be on Iranian terms.
Yeah. Okay. So that's not obviously, we can't predict the future, but it sounds very dire in terms of, despite Trump's assurance that this war is going to finish in the next 2 to 3 weeks, it does sound we're in it for much longer. Okay, and Sarah's back. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I think your internet's just pretty bad, Carlos. I don't know we can really solve that. But go ahead, Sarah.
So I'm seeing Carlos blacked out. I can't see his image. You?
I can see him. Yeah.
Okay, I can't see it. So I have another question for Carlos. We saw that Consortium News reported recently that a US federal judge in New York declined, for now, to dismiss the criminal case against Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. But of course, they reserve the right to revisit the decision. But it was quite an important decision, though, because we had the prosecution wanting to block any access to Venezuela state funds to pay Maduro's lawyers. So actually, Maduro will never have a right to effective defense. So the core issue here is whether denying those funds violates Maduro's Sixth Amendment right to counsel of choice and due process, especially after the Treasury Department briefly issued and then revoked a license that would have allowed payment. I saw this license absolutely ludicrous, this request. So this Judge Elving Hellenstein, so he said that this mounted to a defense, like a serious constitutional concern. If Maduro cannot have the funds to pay his defense, we are not allowing him to have a due process. We are not allowing him to have a defense. And then it's very interesting because the judge said, I'm going to quote the judge, we are doing business with Venezuela. Things have changed in Venezuela. We do business in Venezuela. The oil is important because of the Strait of Hormuz. I found it very extravagant that the judge was talking about the Iran war to justify the fact that Maduro could have access to funds and that case against Maduro was not justifiable as a national security threat. Venezuela was not a national security threat, therefore Maduro could have funds paid. Absolutely crazy. Well, so the judge comment, the oil is important because of the Strait of Hormuz. For me, as a lawyer, it appears to me to be based on considerations what we call unrelated to the merits of the charge against Maduro. So in that sense, I would argue that the reasoning is legally irrelevant, is inappropriate, and could be even described as an error in the exercise of discretion. So I would classify as a extraneous political rather than legal argument. So Carlos, my question to you, why is Iran being brought to Maduro's criminal case at all, in your view?
Yeah, thank you, Sara. I mean, it's actually quite incredible, right? Introducing this idea that the oil is important because of the Strait of Hormuz into a criminal proceeding that was supposed to be about, drug trafficking or whatever ridiculous trumped up charges. It's obviously a category error, right? They've thrown any kind of legal reasoning out of the picture and introduced this geopolitical reasoning, thereby exposing the real rationale behind this show trial of Maduro. It suggests that the judge himself is weighing the defendant's rights against U.S. strategic interests. And if anything, I think that comment strengthens any future appeal because it suggests that the executive's political objectives are contaminating what's supposed to be an independent judicial process. I mean, you know about these things much more than I do. The Treasury Department's behavior, that's issuing a license and then rapidly withdrawing that license to release defense funds, it already looks like you've got the executive branch interfering in the judicial process. So the whole thing is basically farcical, and it reveals the actual logic that's driving US policy towards Venezuela. It's got nothing to do with justice. It's got nothing to do with drug trafficking. It's got nothing to do with protecting the Venezuelan people or democracy or whatever else they talk about. It's about geopolitics. It's about energy flows. It's about the United States wanting Venezuelan oil on its own terms, integrated into a supply chain that it controls. And very specifically, as the judge has pointed out, available as some kind of substitute or some kind of buffer for when energy flows from the Persian Gulf are disrupted. The judge is essentially saying we need to maintain a working relationship with whoever controls Venezuelan oil production, and that that practical interest is shaping how the court thinks about the case. The timing of all this is quite striking, right? Venezuela was attacked. The Maduro and Celia Flores were kidnapped on the 3rd of January this year. Iran was then attacked on the 28th of February, a few weeks later. Now, the US would have known that their war in Iran would mean that the Strait of Hormuz would be closed, because the Iranians have been saying that for months, or probably years. The Iranians have been saying, if we're attacked, we're going to use our leverage in the Strait of Hormuz to disrupt energy flows and to disrupt the global economy, which is completely within their rights to do. 20% of global oil and gas passes through the Strait of Hormuz, so it's very important leverage. So securing control of Venezuelan oil before triggering this crisis in the Persian Gulf kind of makes some obvious strategic sense, looking at it from a very cynical point of view, which is what the United States strategists do. They look at things from a very cynical point of view. They're shoring up alternative Western Hemisphere energy supplies before disrupting the world's most critical energy choke point. Venezuela has got the world's largest proven oil reserves. Previously, those reserves were outside US control. They were flowing largely to China, to Cuba, to other countries that are not aligned with the US-led imperialist system. And as a result of this criminal aggression against Venezuela, as a result of the kidnapping of Maduro and Celia Flores, then the oil situation has changed a little bit, and the Venezuelan government and the government of the Bolivarian Republic, in order to avoid further aggression, and completely legitimately and understandably, in my view, have had to make compromises with the US oil industry. So, I think these operations in Venezuela and Iran are very closely connected, and they're part of a broader strategy of controlling global energy flows, and beyond that, feeding into the overall geopolitical project of ramping up for a future, ramping up their campaign of encirclement and containment of China, and preparing for a future war, a future hot war against China. So, in summary, Judge Hellerstein didn't make any kind of legal argument. He made a confession, which was that this criminal case against Maduro has always just been an instrument of US energy and geopolitical strategy dressed up in judicial clothing. The Venezuela operation, the Iran war, they're two moves in a single strategic campaign which aims at consolidating US control over global energy flows. And as I say, the purpose of that is ultimately directed towards this campaign of encirclement against China. This is all part of the new Cold War. And also, kind of, it exposes the stupidity, with apologies for harsh language, of some people who when the national security strategy was released a few months ago, said, oh, well, the US has accepted multipolarity now. The US has accepted that as long as they are hegemonic in the Americas, then they'll accept Russia having its sphere of influence, and they'll accept China having its sphere of influence. No, it's at a point where the US is involved in a frankly genocidal campaign against Iran. It's got nothing to do with the Monroe Doctrine. It's got nothing to do with acceptance of multipolarity. Everything is directed towards gearing up for the final existential battle against China. Actually, I think that ship has sailed. It's too late. They're not winning in Iran. They're not going to win in Venezuela. They're not going to win in Cuba. They're not going to get their way because, as we've remarked earlier in this show, imperialism isn't all powerful, but they are lashing out, hitting out in all directions, desperate to maintain their hegemony, desperate to project their domination of the 20th century into the 21st century. They can't imagine not being able to do that, but actually the reality on the ground and the rise of the global south and the rise of China and the rise of BRICS and so on means that they can't dominate in the way that they want to and in the way that they used to. It's going to take them a long time to catch up with and accept that reality.
So what you're telling me here is the novelty, actually, that you think the attack on Venezuela was pre-planned.
Sorry, Sarah. Before we go on, Carlos, you're just completely frozen. Can you do anything about that? Is there any way, like maybe hop on and hop off?
You didn't hear my contribution, huh?
No, we heard it. It's just that you're completely frozen. I was just wondering if there's a way that we can get you back on.
Okay.
To moving.
I'll try reconnecting. And yeah.
Ironically, now you're not frozen, but it's probably not going to last very long.
So I think Carlos brought a point here, which I think is very novel. He's saying, and it's the first time I'm hearing this argument, which makes total sense, is that Venezuela and Iran were coordinated strategies. Let's go for Venezuela oil first. Let's ensure we have some oil there, and then we go for Iran. It makes total sense, doesn't it?
I mean,
the thinking, and all as a overall strategy of war on China. I think it's a very interesting political reading, and it makes total sense.
I think there's definitely a suggestion of that, Carlos. I mean, whether or not are they really capable of doing it in that orderly of a fashion, or is it just like the overall? I mean, I guess it doesn't even matter. The overall push for shoring up oil, they're kind of doing that across the world with oil, but also with the rare earth minerals. Every single trade agreement that they've signed the last year has been in inclusion of rare earth minerals. I mean, I think it's like anywhere that they do see resources, they try to stockpile it or conquer it in some way. So, I mean, I totally agree that that's the overall strategy, but whether or not it's like step 1, step 2, step 3, I don't know if it's really at that level.
Yeah, it's not it's not so simple, and there are multiple factors to, for example, the need to get control of Venezuela's oil resources. That's partly, and I was assuming at the time, most importantly, that.
Oh no! Now he's frozen completely. Okay, you're back. Okay.
You hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you and see you.
Okay. Yeah, I was assuming in January that the primary reason for the attack on Venezuela was to cut off energy supplies to Cuba. So, because Venezuela has been for about 25 years, by far and away the largest supplier of energy to Cuba, which doesn't have much energy production of its own. And during when the Soviet Union existed, Soviet Union provided nearly all of Cuba's energy resources. And then Chavez elected in 1999 and immediately established excellent relations with Cuba. And Venezuela was providing, at its peak, it was like 100,000 barrels a day of oil to Cuba. And Cuba in return was providing medical support, logistical support, teachers. There were thousands of Cuban doctors working in the barrios in Venezuela, in poor and working class districts that Venezuelan doctors would literally refuse to go to because Venezuelan doctors up to that point had been trained in the old period where they were from the upper class or they were from the upper middle class. It wouldn't occur to them to go into a barrio in Caracas. So that was being provided by Cuba. Cuba provided a lot of the expertise for Venezuela's literacy campaign, et cetera, et cetera. So they had this beautiful kind of symbiotic relationship. And, clearly part of the attack on Venezuela and part of the rationale for getting control of Venezuela's oil flows was to cut off Cuba's oil flows to impose an energy blockade on Cuba. Is also, as we've been talking about, related to China and the ability to control the flow of oil from Venezuela to China. Venezuela is a major oil exporter. China is a major oil importer. Maybe 80% of Venezuela's oil had been going to China, and Venezuela is the only country in Latin America with which China has a comprehensive strategic partnership. I mean, China has excellent relations with nearly every Latin American country and nearly every Caribbean country, but they're particularly strong relations with Venezuela. As I said, they had a comprehensive strategic partnership. Venezuela's been providing huge volumes of oil to China. China's been providing huge level of investment in Venezuela, and a lot of these amazing social programs and housing programs, et cetera, in Venezuela have been funded essentially with Chinese financing. So that was another motivation for the United States in getting control of Venezuela's oil, is to be able to cut off that flow if they decide they need to. For the moment, the Americans have said, no, we don't want to cut off Venezuela's flow of oil to Cuba. We'll let that carry on. But the point is, if they control it, they can choose when to turn the taps on and when to turn the taps off, right? So that was the second aspect. And then the third aspect, which has emerged and which we've just been talking about, is they probably knew that this disruption was coming in the Persian Gulf. And therefore, it suited their interests to secure control of energy resources in another part of the world, to give them some redundancy built in, basically. So I think it's not so simple as, they'll take out Venezuela in order to give themselves the freedom to operate in Iran. But I think that's part of it.
Right. Well said. Thank you, Carlos. Okay, so Sara, do you want to go on to your watch? We're already at 90 minutes. I thought we were going to have a shorter show today without Joe joining us, but turns out not.
Turns out not. Well, so we have this week a death penalty being announced to Palestinians. So Israeli Knesset has advanced, it's not yet passed, but has advanced a death penalty bill for Palestinian prisoners. And it's crazy. We have here Ben-Gvir, who else, National Security Minister, outside of Knesset chamber, celebrating the passing of the death penalty law for Palestinian detainees, describing it as historic and saying, "Soon we'll count them one by one." I want to show you this video. And this comes in a context. That we are going to illustrate later. Here's him, Ben-Gvir, who else, celebrating this death penalty on Palestinians. It's very interesting because the death penalty is for a specific nationality, a specific ethnicity. We're not saying death penalty for those who try to kill Israelis, for Palestinians. I mean, who can possibly say that Zionism and Israel, the state of Israel, is founded on racism, is founded on Jewish supremacy.
השר, על מה כל החגיגה?
מוות המחבלים עבר היום, חוק מוות המחבלים, היסטוריה, היסטוריה. בעזרת השם בקרוב, אחד אחד להוציא להורג, כל אלה שטבחו ורצחו ושרפו, לחיים, לחיי עם ישראל. לזמן הזה,
And what he's saying. They're just sort of cheering. Are they the
Historic. And they want to do it by the camera, for the cameras. I think this video should be remembered again and again. I mean, we have loads of videos that we can remember ever again, but this does not come out of the blue. This background to this legislation is pretty clear. It has to do with IDF going mental, the Israeli occupation, racist forces going mental and acting like the settlers do. Well, we had now on the 26th of March in Tayassi, in West Bank, we had CNN journalists attacked on camera. I'm going to show this video. Let me put this video up, and while I'm commenting this here is scandalous, because this is, of course, this is daily life for Palestinian people, but as we know, this time around, CNN got it on camera. Those are strong images, so those who feel sensitive about it may not want to watch it. We have here the Israeli settlers. They launched a night attack on the Palestinian village of Tayassir, and this is Abdullah Daragmed. He's 75. He was beaten in his home while he was sleeping. He has fractured skull, multiple broken facial bones, lose his teeth, and three others along with him are hospitalized. It's just a man sleeping in his bed. And 12 hours later, the Israeli soldiers arrived, and instead of detaining the settlers or dismantling the new illegal outpost they had established, what they turned on Palestinian residents and on the CNN crew. This is the footage of the part of the incident. And you see how a soldier grabbed photojournalist, old settler Yehuda Sherman, and said that Palestinians were responsible and they were acting on an act of revenge on Palestinians. Nothing has been proved about this murder or this killing of Yehuda Sherman. We don't know. There's no proof of anything. But I think this links to this legislation. What we have here is revenge being legalized against an ethnicity. And this is not crazy settlers. This is not crazy soldiers going mental. This is not incompatible with the IDF general policy. This is a state policy, because once you pass in parliament, you are sealing and saying, this is our state policy. This is institutionalizing racism. So this is quite important. We are punished with that sentence, the fact that you're a Palestinian. If anyone get killed here, we can say it was you. And we're going to kill you because you are a Palestinian.
Can you talk a little bit about that video before we move on? Because it's really interesting. CNN they have a history of doing these sort of enactment videos and pretending that they're real. And so my first sort of question is, first of all, is this one of those videos?
No, we have fact checked this. This is a real video. This is correct. These are Israeli soldiers.
Sure, but even within that, just sort of questioning, because CNN actually does real videos, but they do it in a false way. So just to say CNN is not a credible source at all, but more importantly, I'm just sort of questioning. I'm not doubting Israelis' apartheid genocidal impulses. They're definitely racist. They're definitely apartheid. They're definitely genocidal. That's hands down true. What I'm sort of asking at this moment is why CNN is airing this, suddenly there's a shift in tone, right? Like that goes from CNN really being, pro-Israel, I suppose, as the US is pro-Israel, to now sort of exposing crimes of Israel. And so what does that mean in terms of the distancing from the US to Israel? Yeah, exactly. One of our commenters are talking about Clarissa Ward. She did a fake sort of reenactment type of video previously. But yeah, what does this mean that CNN is now covering Israel in this critical manner, highlighting racism, apartheid, and genocide in a way that, well, maybe they're not talking about genocide, right? They're not using the term genocide, but there is a shift in tone from CNN. What does that sort of mean in this point in time? That's kind of what I'm sort of questioning.
Yeah, I will leave this question for Carlos to answer, but I'm just going to add to that. We all know CNN was established for the Iraq war as a propaganda machine for the Iraq war. But I think one of the main shifts we have seen is that Israeli propaganda at a certain level became unattainable, even within the US, even within the MAGA structure. Even the very conservative forces today, this was dismantled. We had a New York, a place where 30% of the Jews voted for a Muslim mayor. So there's definitely the Palestinian resistance, the Palestinian courage. The Palestinians have historically sent a message of anti-colonial resistance. And our generation, for the first time, heard this message. We saw 24/7 genocide in pictures, children dying, people being obliterated while trying to have food. I think the bravery of the Palestinian people, of the Iranian resistance, have changed a lot, and even CNN had to report. And of course, this is their own journalists, Ileana. I mean, when you have your own journalists being attacked by the occupation forces, it gains weight. Oh, it does gain weight. So, and you do have brave journalists, single journalists within those.
I question that CNN is doing this for the right reasons. I'm just going to put it out there. I'm very hesitant to give them props for that, because they've shown.
I'll let Carlos comment on this, because I think he's better placed than I am to comment.
Yeah, I think, Sara, you basically said what needed to be said. I think what's really interesting now is that for the first time ever, you've got a majority of people in the United States that oppose what Israel is doing and who support Palestinian national rights. This is unprecedented, and there's nuances within that. I'm sure the majority of Republican voters still, by and large, support Israel, and the majority of Democratic voters would be more inclined towards supporting Palestinian national rights. But either way, there's been an absolute sea change, for the US, which has, since the establishment of the State of Israel, and particularly since the Suez Canal crisis, and from the mid-50s onwards, been the principal supporter, diplomatically, economically, militarily, of the State of Israel. To have a population which is opposed to what Israel is doing is huge. It's unprecedented. It's never happened before. And so I think, if CNN is changing its narrative a little bit, to make some concessions to, the most basic level of decency and justice, and if the New York Times is changing its narrative a little bit, I think that's just a reflection of a demand of the population of those countries and the consumers of that media. And that in itself is essentially, as Sara has said, a reflection of Palestinian heroism and resilience and resistance in the face of unimaginable oppression.
Sure, but I mean, I think
this resistance against genocide has resonated globally. It's changed politics throughout the West. It's changed media throughout the West. It's led to a level of political chaos, right?
I totally agree with that, but I do have to say that when we're looking at the US, right, we also have to see that Gavin Newsom and Andy Beshear just came out, like they were questioned, I think maybe by CNN or actually another media network, about whether or not they are still does Israel still have a right to exist? And essentially they're both still Zionists. So you have key figures in the Democratic Party still going along with this pro-Israel sentiment, even though I totally agree with you that probably there's a huge majority of the population that aren't. But you know what I mean? Like there's some interesting cracks here going on, because CNN is considered more of a liberal type of news org, whereas Fox is like the right-wing one. But then you have like certain MAGA groups that are not anti-Israel, just like anti-continuing to fund, they're more libertarian in a sense. They're sort of skewing that way. So now you've got kind of like this interesting thing of like CNN liberal network somewhat holding these Democrats to account in this way. It's a very interesting dynamic that's happening right now. So yeah, so I'm just sort of questioning it. Also with CNN, this video to me looks like one of their reenactments. So I'm just like questioning that.
Yeah, I don't think it represents the producers at CNN becoming progressive or even anti-genocide in any meaningful way. But I do think, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the limits of imperialist power, I do think even a massive imperialist neoliberal news organization like CNN, which would be part of a bigger conglomerate, has to make certain concessions to popular opinion. So, and just the last thing, just to quickly say on this issue of the death penalty for Palestinians that's been approved by the Knesset, is that this proves that Israel is everything that it says it's not, right? It proves that Israel is an apartheid state, that it's a colonial entity, that it's a racist, Nazi, supremacist state based on a racist, Nazi, supremacist ideology. They hate that. They say that it's anti-Semitic to say that, but they're proving with their actions that everything that's said about Israel is true. I mean, they've just killed at least an absolute minimum of 80,000 people in Gaza, right? We don't know the true numbers. According to the Lancet, it could be 200,000. But at least 10% of the Gazan population has been either killed or injured. They bombed literally every hospital in Gaza. They bombed schools, they bombed apartment buildings, they bombed refugee camps, tents, right? So where's the death penalty for the people who perpetrated those crimes? So I think, to introduce the death penalty specifically for one ethnicity, for Palestinians, if people needed any more proof that Israel is an apartheid state, well, okay, you've got it now.
So I guess like my question there is to Sara, I don't know if you I don't think you already said this. Why are they introducing this now? This is so clearly a apartheid racist thing to do. Is there enough in their population support for something like this? Is this actually supported by the Israeli population, and that's why they're introducing it now? Because obviously internationally this is not going to make them look good at all.
I also think, Carlos, if you want to comment on that, I think Israeli population full on supports a genocide. And I think Norman Finkelstein also brought the numbers of it. 80% of the Israeli population think it's okay to kill Palestinians. And I mean, those 80,000 people who are no longer here, it's also a death penalty to obliterate. I think they're just closing the gaps. They are closing we had bombing them, we're genociding them of all sides. We're genociding them when they're detainees, we're genociding them. It's just getting more bolder and closing the gap. And I think one of the strategies of Israel of getting bolder, of course, they are losing. They lost the narrative. The industry of the Holocaust is no longer being able to win minds and hearts. This is destroyed, won't be back. But I also think the harder they escalate against Palestinians, the more they aim to divide the Palestinian resistance. The harder we go on them, the harder we show on Palestinian people that, you supported Hamas, there you go. Now we're gonna go even harder on you. So I think Israel has this strategy, and they have full support over full-blown racist, supremacist society. Is absolutely disgusting. Israeli society is a Nazified society. There's no other way to put it. And it's not a state like Germany that became Nazi. It's a state that was founded, construed under colonization and under the supremacy of Jewish people. Zionism, let's remove a little bit the word Zionism and talk, it's Jewish supremacy, what they are doing, executing here. I think they're closing the gaps, but I don't know, Carlos, you might have more information on that one.
No, but also, I mean, I know that you're going to go on to talk about how.
So I'll carry on with my final part of my watch.
Yeah, you're going to go to just.
Yeah, I think we are just having a escalating war on Lebanon.
Can you not hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just going to say that you're going to be going on to basically what I've heard Rania Khalek say, that they're trying to do to Lebanon what they've already done to Gaza. They're trying to expand it onto Lebanon, right?
Yeah, I think they have expressly said, Israeli authorities, that they want to create a buffer zone and seize South Lebanon. And of course they want to seize Lebanon. The water is on Lebanon. Israel has no water. And they want to destroy Hezbollah. So we see here this escalating war in Lebanon. We are talking about here 1,200 people killed, 48 of them health workers, 1 to 4 killed kids. And I'm talking about 2 days ago. We have over 3,500 injured since March 2. We have 1.2 million people displaced. This is 20% of the Lebanese population has been displaced. We have recently UN peacekeepers from Indonesia killed, 3 of them, and we have 220 journalists killed. The numbers are telling a story. And, it's always like Hezbollah is provoking. No, since the ceasefire in 2024, Israel has breached nearly every day, and we are talking about thousands and thousands of times where Israel broke the ceasefire. I was talking lately with a specialist in my latest show in Brazil, and he said, we can talk about thousands of times of Israel breaching the ceasefire. So we have a offensive expansion on the ground. We see Beirut being struck repeatedly. Netanyahu ordering further expansion on the ground operations toward the Litani River. So they have bombed roads, petrol stations, breached medical centers, everything to isolate. The strategy here is to isolate southern Lebanon. So all bridges south of the Litani have been destroyed. We see loads of attacks in Beirut's district, killing people, wounded dozens of people. And I think Israel signs a permanent occupation and mass demolition. I think Rania is not saying this out of the blue. So the defense minister Katz, he said they will maintain the security zone, what he calls security zone on the Litani River, even if the war ends, and that displaced Lebanese will be barred from returning in the homes through the Israeli security. This is what they say, right? So that's annexation. I think if you take it all together, you can talk about annexation and disbursement, definitive displacement of the people, and far more. They are one of their tactics to create those buffer zones is to burn fields with white phosphorus, so they can create a visibility of the field, they can push civilians away. So we are talking here, there's a study for the Delft University saying that they use nearly 100 times between October 2023 and November 24 in 1 year. White phosphorus, 39% are residential areas. So white phosphorus is heavily toxic, saturates the earth, doesn't go away, heavy metals, degrades the completely possibility of agriculture long term. And imagine what it also does to people. We had journalists killed. This is what we call war crime. These people were reporting on the front lines and they were killed. They have been framed before by Israel. One of them escaped a bomb attack. Fatima Futuni, her brother, they're both killed, but they have been targeted. And I think it's safe to say that Israel knows where those journalists are and goes for them. I don't think it's just, it's a collateral damage, the killing of the street journalists. We all have very good reasons to believe that journalism is one of the people targeted and people they will aim to obliterate in Lebanon. It's a very dangerous place. So we are talking about 1.2 million people being displaced in 4 weeks, thousands of children, clinics closing, school becoming shelters. I think, so Lebanon, I think it's safe to say, and this is also UN opinion, Lebanon risks becoming another occupied territory. Carlos, I don't know if you want to comment on Lebanon. I think people expect me to know anything about Lebanon because of my grandfather's Lebanese, but I found it utterly complex to talk about Lebanon, and I don't think I'm very well placed to say anything proper about it.
No, I thought you said what needed to be said for the moment. I don't have much to add to that.
Is everyone muted? Okay. Sorry, I think you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I just said that I didn't have anything much to add to what Sara had already said in relation to Lebanon.
Yeah, it's a very scary situation for Lebanon, and escalating really quickly, I think. So, yeah. But thank you, Sara, for giving us that report. And also, you are Lebanese. That's what we've learned today.
I don't know that.
I did know that, but maybe the audience didn't know that you were.
Okay. Well, my grandfather was Lebanese. Let's put it this way. And Carlos think I look super Lebanese, which I think he's right. Yeah.
Yeah, you look Italian, you look Lebanese, you look Turkish, you look Brazilian. Do you look Brazilian? Yeah. Okay, cool. So today, my watch, I'm gonna be doing it on the Taiwan KMT leader, Cheng Li-wen, visit to China. She's expected to meet Xi Jinping in maybe next week. And she was invited, and I just want to say that she gladly accepted this invitation. Now, this is a historic thing, and I'm going to ask you a question at the end of it because I don't know, and maybe like Carlos kind of gave a spoiler alert on this just before previously onto what he may think about this. But basically, the KMT, this is the first in 10 years. So there is a significant shift here, considering the rest of the geopolitical scenario that we're looking at. And just to say also that this is going to be a month before Trump is scheduled to meet Xi Jinping in Beijing in May 14 and 15. And obviously, as we know, China does not make they don't make mistakes like this. This is obviously a clear indication, right? This is a diplomatic indication. They've always said that Taiwan and mainland China, we are one country and that it's an internal matter. Even though every time a foreign leader goes to see, or at least the US president goes to see, visits Beijing, there's always something about Taiwan in the news. But let's look into it here. So basically, I'm terrible at name, Cheng Li-wen, the chairperson of the Kuomintang, she made these two statements in her speech. The global community adheres to a one China policy and does not support Taiwanese independence, reflecting the prevailing sentiment among Taiwan's public. Which, let's just remind everyone, the Taiwanese public is over 80% in favor of the status quo. And the status quo is sort of this ambiguous two governments, one country. It's sort of a diplomatic ambiguity that is supposed to be moving towards peaceful reunification in like 2049. That's kind of like the overall, I think, understanding on both sides of the strait. And the Kuomintang is not necessarily the ruling party. It does, however, have 52 seats in the, I guess, would it be called the Congress? So it has a majority of seats there by one. The DPP, which is what the current leader of the Taiwan region, Lai Ching-te, he's from the DPP party that has 51 seats. So it's fair to say that Taiwan is incredibly divided in terms of these two parties. But these are the two. It's basically a duopoly here. And DPP, which is the Ching Lai-te current leader, is very pro-US. So, you know, me and Sarah, we've talked about it on this show, like how Ching Lai-te has, like, he's a pro-Israel, he loves AIPAC, he loves the US. He's just like a very obsequious, odious US puppet sort of character. He's not pretending at all in any way. The KMT, however, has more of a slightly neutral stance. It is obviously clearly showing that they have the one China policy. They're open to diplomatic communication. She's obviously a little bit more direct in her communication style. She's more clearly wanting to strengthen ties with China, and she was just elected at the end of last year. So this kind of suggests a shift towards China and opening up more agreements with China. The current sort of conversation in Taiwan, though, is the prevailing US propaganda one, which is what is going to happen to the $40 billion military, they're calling it the defense plan, but it's really a military plan that the US is pressuring Taiwan to sign off on. If you remember, a few weeks ago, we talked to Taiwanese Marxist rapper Shang Yu, and he talked about how the government proposed this plan in Congress. I don't know what it's called, but basically with two pages with no information on what the $40 billion would be spent on. It was basically like there was no transparency on it. It didn't explain at all where that $40 billion would go over the next 8 years. And just to remind everyone, Taiwan is a very small country. It only has 24 million people. So $40 billion over 8 years is a significant increase in military budget. They currently have an annual military budget of around $30 billion. So that would be an extra $5 billion per year. So if we think about it that way, it's a significant chunk of money to then go, oh, we have 2 pages here, but no itemized details. Please sign off on it. And they're being pressured by the US to do that, even to the point where this week, 4 bipartisan representatives from the US, senators, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats visited Taiwan and essentially was trying to get them to sign off convinced the different politicians in in Taiwan to sign off on this $40 billion military budget. And the military budget, as most US military budgets work, this type of military plans work in the US. It's basically about giving money to the US military industrial complex, and then they might give you weapons or they might not. So one of the main reasons for opposing this military budget plan is that they have already paid for weapons to the US, but they have not received all the weapons that they've already paid for. So why are they then being asked to pay for another 40 billion military, $40 billion to the US, basically? I mean, a big percentage of this military plan is going to go to the US, specifically the military industrial complex. So that's where we're kind of at here with that. But I do want to say that there are some very contradictory things happening. Again, we have those 4 senators this week going to Taiwan saying the US has your back. You're going to need to sign off on this $40 billion plan because you need protection. And then at the same time, last month, the US, and there was reports even on the New York Times, etc., that was saying that US intelligence has found that China is not going to invade Taiwan in 2027. So that's kind of like an indication that there are kind of cracks here, because we've been told basically this entire time that China is going to invade itself. China mainland is going to invade Taiwan, its own province. We've been told that as a justification for why the US is gearing up for a war against China. And then suddenly the change of tune last month, and this is called these top secret US reports. These US intelligence reports are saying that China is not going to invade. And then before that, we had top secret US reports warns American forces would drastically be outmatched by China. So, so we basically have these contrasting messages. On one hand, they're trying to get Taiwan to pass this $40 billion military budget. On the other hand, they're saying that US intelligence is saying there are no threats. China is not going to invade. And then, of course, we have top secret leaks, which I'm putting quotations around top secret because they're obviously leaked for a reason, saying that America is outmatched by China. So my question to you guys is, what do you guys think of this? Is this a strategic retreat from the US? Although, like we've said, this is a new Cold War, and Carlos has already sort of talked about this before. Or is this an indication of US's waning power as the Iran war is not going their way? What do you guys think about that? What are the other actual de-escalatory actors within the US? Is this a tactical retreat, or, what do you think is going on?
I'm not the expert on China here. I think this is a question tailor-made for Carlos. Sorry to put it on your lap.
Go, Carlos.
Sure. I mean, Ileana, you've covered most of it. I think there's a lot of variables here. And the broader geopolitical question that you've identified is essentially, do countries and regions around the world want to hitch their wagon to a declining US imperialism or a rising Chinese socialism and multipolarity? And that's, in an interesting and subtle kind of way, that's a question that the ruling class in Taiwan province is having to address itself. The DPP government is highly unpopular, massively corrupt, it's likely to suffer very badly in the coming elections. It's been engaged in ridiculous brinkmanship against China, against the People's Republic, pushing forward a independence, a separatist agenda, which actually goes against Taiwan's constitution, right? In the sense, we celebrate the Kuomintang being relatively pro-China or supporting the One China principle, but the idea of One China is also part of Taiwan's constitution, which of course was written by Chiang Kai-shek and his collaborators in the Kuomintang. But as far as the Taiwan's constitution is concerned, there is only one China, and its headquarters is in Taipei, right? They still claim all of China, but they think they run it, which is similar to the People's Republic approach, which is that there is only one China, and its capital is Beijing. So it's the DPP who are the kind of the historical outliers here, who are going against that and shifting towards independence and a separatist position, and they're very much encouraged in that by the United States, which has always aimed to use Taiwan Island as part of its first island change encirclement strategy against China. That was the reason that Taiwan is kind of a de facto separate territory in the first place, because the Truman administration in 1950 positioned its 7th Fleet of the US Navy in the Taiwan Straits to prevent Taiwan from being reabsorbed into the People's Republic, so that it could be de facto independent, and so that it could be de facto under the control of the United States, so that the United States could deploy troops there, it could deploy weapon systems there, it could be used along with South Korea, along with Japan, along with the Philippines, along with Guam, as an overall system of power projection in the Pacific and in the South China Sea, in order to contain and potentially suffocate China, right? So, but we're also seeing US imperialism in a process of chronic and fairly severe decline. So, and for example, that's manifested in things like the Mark Carney speech at the World Economic Forum that people were talking about a couple of months ago. That this Canadian Prime Minister has stood up at an international forum and said, we can't rely on the United States anymore. We've been living this dream where we all lined up behind the United States and we trusted it to do the right thing and to represent our collective interests. And we always knew it was nonsense, but we went along with it because we got some crumbs from the imperialist table. Obviously, he didn't use those words; those are my words, or more likely Lenin's words. But that was the substance of it. We were minor players in an ongoing imperialist war from which we benefited, so we went along with it. And now that's coming to an end. We can't rely on the US anymore. The US is a declining power. The US is an aggressive and a hegemonic and a dominating power, which acts only in its own interests and not in the interests of Europe, not in the interests of Canada, certainly not in the interests of Latin America or the Caribbean or Africa or Asia or the Pacific. So I think on the basis of the DPP government being increasingly unpopular and having hitched its wagon completely to Trumpism and to US hegemonism, which is any sensible person would say is bound to fail. I think the Kuomintang is benefiting from that and is adopting a much more pragmatic program focused on economic cooperation with People's Republic, focused on cross-strait cooperation. And Cheng Li-wen is an interesting person. She won the election as chair of the KMT by a huge majority, and she's known for being relatively more pro-Beijing, for wanting closer ties with Beijing. Her predecessor, Eric Chu, didn't visit China during his term as chair that started in 2021. So in those 4 years, he didn't visit the People's Republic. Chen Liwen, within a few months of being elected as chair, said she's going to China. She was invited by the International Department of the CPC in order to promote relations between the two organizations, in order to promote peaceful development of cross-strait relations. And this is something that benefits Taiwan. China is far and away the major trading partner for Taiwan. There are lots of Chinese investment in Taiwan. Huge numbers of workers from Taiwan province who are working in Beijing, who are working in Fujian, who are working in Shanghai, etc. It doesn't make any sense for Taiwan to spend billions and billions of dollars on US-made weapons. That's just a subsidy. Why should the Taiwanese working class subsidize United States imperialism by spending ridiculous amounts of money on weapons that they don't even control? They don't even have operational control over. So, I think there's a gradual shift in Taiwan back towards sensible cooperation with China, and recognizing that China doesn't have any interest in kind of unilaterally taking over Taiwan, going to war over Taiwan. Beijing takes a very long-term view. Beijing is obviously, it wants reunification. It's obviously doing everything that it can to move towards gradual, peaceful reunification, which, by the way, would leave Taiwan with a massive level of autonomy. You're going far beyond what you have with Hong Kong and one country, two systems. Essentially, Taiwan would be able to maintain its economic system, maintain its social system, maintain its internal security. The only meaningful difference is that defense policy and international relations would be handled by Beijing. But other than that, Taiwan could carry on being a capitalist territory. It could carry on, with so-called independent, i.e., corporate media, et cetera. But that's a long-term process. Beijing is not about to go to war and unilaterally take over Taiwan. And the Chinese have been very clear on that. Actually, China's policy in relation to Taiwan hasn't meaningfully changed in 75 years. They've always said, we want reunification. The fact that Taiwan is a de facto separate territory is a hangover from colonialism, from the colonial era. Taiwan was occupied by Japan at the end of the 19th century. Japan occupied it and colonized it until 1945 and Japan's defeat in World War II. It was agreed at Potsdam. It was agreed at Yalta in all the conferences around what a post-war world looked like, that Taiwan would be returned to Chinese control. So, the fact that Taiwan is de facto separate is a hangover from colonialism. And the Chinese view is that the world is in a post-colonial era now. And so we want to rectify that historical injustice. But they're not in any kind of hurry. And they always say, we reserve the right to military intervention in Taiwan in a situation where Taiwan unilaterally declares independence, or there is external foreign interference, i.e., the US were to build military bases in Taiwan or attempt to treat it essentially as a military outpost of the United States. And of course, any that's a completely reasonable and understandable position for China to take. But they take, as I say, they take a very long-term view, and the Kuomintang, which will no doubt be a very important player in the next Taiwanese government, is shifting towards better and more sensible ties with Beijing, is very positive. So I think things are going in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you for that, because I think that is one of the things that people I'm sure, Sarah, you've heard this as well. Like, people are just like, why doesn't China just leave Taiwan alone? Like, why, and it's clear that it's about defense here, because as we've talked about before, Taiwan is kind of seen as this unsinkable battleship for the US. It's also where Japan can kind of invade from, into China from. It's in a strategic position. So you can't just leave it to be co-opted by foreign powers. There's a strategic defense reason to have Taiwan incorporated more fully into one China. But it's not about colonizing or like taking over the country. And, by the way, they are Chinese. Sorry, but they are. They're Chinese. They know that. We know that. They're also over 95% Han Chinese, by the way, and maybe 2 to 3% indigenous. So they are literally Chinese. And I'm sure they feel that as well. Anyway, thank you so much for that, Carlos. Sarah, like, any last comments on that? Do you know more about Taiwan now after 2 shows?
You're asking me?
Yeah, because you're always
Yeah,
like,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I've been massively educated on many new themes. Yeah, hopefully the audience.
Yeah, hopefully the audience as well. Thank you, Carlos, for all that information today. Yeah, so thank you so much. We actually are wrapping before 3 hours, which is, it's not a record, but at least.
Yeah, I just need to clarify. I have not baked any cake for Ukraine.
Okay,
I have not bought any cake for Ukraine. I have not visited the baking sales theme for Ukraine. I would never do that. But
you were pressured to, right? And resisted. You were pressured to, and you were resisted.
I resisted. Right? Yeah, they would go table to table. Have you already bought something for Ukraine? Have you? I'll say I'll do that later.
Later,
when Ukraine becomes Russian, I'll buy the cake. Donbass becomes Russian, I'll buy the cake.
Ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. This is the state of the U.S. government, the UK government, and the U.S. government. I just want to remind everyone we're doing a Cuba special live on Monday at 7 p.m. So please join us there. We will be talking to the Asada Shakur Brigade. So just a quick reminder there. And any last words before we go? Apart from that, Sarah is not a baker for Ukraine.
I'm just, Sarah's not a baker in general. I'm just very interested to know if we were to set up a Russia-Palestine bake sale, if she could be persuaded to change the habits of a lifetime and do some cooking.
Yeah, I would do that. Yeah, for your sake.
My mom has this trick. I'm going to give it away right here on a live, where she gets some baked goods from a bakery and then it's like, oh, look at me, I did this for charity, only for charity. Yeah, I've just given away her secrets, but that's what you can do, Sarah. For charity, for the resistance.
No, okay, I would learn how to cook for the resistance. I would go that far. Yeah,
you're better,
for the resistance, no, for the attack.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you. If anyone wants to share some recipes for Sarah in the comments, go ahead. But thank you everyone for watching, and hopefully I'll see you guys on Monday. And if you can't make that, then we'll see you next week, same time, noon, London, on Friday. So we'll see you there. Bye everyone. I'm in the stream.